Just before we start this episode, just a quick apology. Parts of the episode, there will be a bit of background noise. We tried really hard to get this episode together and to find a quiet space to record, and it just wasn't happening. So if you do hear dogs barking or any other cars or annoying sounds, we're sorry, but just bear with us. Welcome to episode 3 of Let's Rage Together, a podcast where two friends talk about total liberation and related topics.
Annihilated the world before your very ears.
You can't handle the truth.
Hey everyone, welcome to the third episode of Let's Rage Together. I'm Pete.
And I'm Taryn.
And on today's episode, we're talking about burnout and self-care, working towards sustainable activism. We'll also be discussing 2 listener comments that were sent in. In the last episode, we didn't get around to thanking everyone who gave us feedback from the first episode. So to Cara, Wes, Ayel, Sean, Nawara, Paul, Francois, Aragon, and Scott, thank you so much for your feedback and your kind words. It really means a lot.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And before we get into the listener feedback questions and the main discussion, just a quick content warning. We are discussing mental health today, so there will be mention of things like trauma, anxiety, depression, and domestic violence. We're not going to go into details on any of these topics, but we just wanted to give you a heads up in case there's anything that you might want to skip over.
So in the last episode, you brought up Akashinga, and the first listener comment came in from Robin on her perspective on Akashinga.
Yeah, and just for some context for those of you who missed the last episode, firstly, shame on you for missing it.
Shame on you.
But just so that you have a bit of understanding about what we're talking about, Akashinga is an anti-poaching unit set up in Zimbabwe, and it's made up entirely of women, mostly from very disadvantaged backgrounds with histories of domestic violence, or they're orphans or single mothers, and it's an anti-poaching unit that empowers them and their communities. And it's vegan as well, which is awesome. Yeah.
So I guess we should just get into Robin's comments and then we can talk about it from there. She says, I'm so stoked you brought up Akashinga. I read about it the other day and watched a brief BBC snippet about the unit. I cried when I watched it because of all the positives it has. However, I often encounter a bit of an ethical dilemma when it comes to this sort of approach to conservation, where violence is used. Obviously, I understand why anti-poaching units are armed, as they need to protect themselves as well as the animals from poachers who will kill them without hesitation in order to get to the animals. But, like one Akashinga member says, she doesn't care whether it's her brother or her neighbor. She would catch them, which may include killing depending on the nature of the encounter. And knowing that a lot of poachers are merely opportunistic, underprivileged people themselves who are trying to feed their own families, etc. But because there is a market for poached animals or animal parts, there will always be a poacher because the poor are being exploited by this market. I despise guns and anything that is built to kill and promotes war. And when I see conservation that uses this tactic, I'm not always sure where I stand. Does it become the ends justify the means sort of outlook? Because I do believe in the use of violence in use as defense. However, in this context, where the people involved are the poor and they are fighting against other poor people who are doing what they are doing, poaching, as a means of survival, maybe not the case for everyone, I don't know. Does it not take the responsibility away from those who are the ones who are creating this market and profiteering off of something that is just perpetuating a form of war? And therefore, is this form of conservation viable and justifiable? It is the capitalist opportunists who are perpetuating and feeding this issue. So that's Robin's comment, and quite a lot of thoughts and questions packed into it. What do you think of this, T?
Yeah, I'm really glad that Robin raised these points because I think they're all really important considerations. And I agree with the overall thought process here for the most part. I don't really know what the training entails for Akashinga, so I'm not sure if the violence would be used only as an absolute last resort and a means of defense only. So it's quite difficult to make a judgment call without all of the information. So I had a look at the AIPF.org websites for a bit more info on their training, and this is a quote from the site. The women who have graduated into this program received the same law enforcement training and fulfill the same role as the male ranger, learning skills such as leadership, unarmed combat, patrolling, camouflage and concealment, first aid, dangerous wildlife awareness, democratic policing, search and arrest, human rights, crime scene preservation, crisis management, firearms safety and use, information gathering, and conservation ethics. It goes on to say the team is exposed to danger in their role, as are all male rangers, an unfortunate reality of conservation work. Women, however, are much better at de-escalating situations as opposed to antagonizing them. The women in this program are working towards prevention rather than cure. They are prepared to deal with escalation of threat against them, but trained to democratically police the area as opposed to ruling it with force. So my sort of instinctive response has two opposing but related considerations. Firstly, it was mentioned that these women are all from very disadvantaged backgrounds, and the group is made up of orphans, wives of poachers in prison, victims of domestic violence, for example. So taking their probably traumatic, for many of them, backgrounds into consideration, the woman who made the comment that implies being willing to catch her brother, whatever that may entail, might not really be surprising if that individual comes from a violent and abusive background. And, obviously we can't assume that, but if that is the case, I'd say there might be a justification in her willingness to use force against a possibly violent relative, because that person's also engaging in further violence against animals as a means of income. I think it might also be quite empowering for the woman to learn these kinds of self-defense tactics, because it can give them a sense of autonomy and improve their self-worth overall, because I would imagine that their previous situations could leave them feeling very hopeless and with a low level of self-worth. So it's a great way for them to change their entire self-concept from possibly being that of victim to warrior, which I think is pretty awesome. I also think that people who engage in illegal and violent acts, not just poaching, but a lot of these sort of underground crime syndicates, usually do so out of some level of necessity, at least like from some perspective or from their worldview. And many of these industries are definitely maintained by oppressive and capitalist systems, and the problem's always going to be larger than we can probably even understand. And I think to some extent, often it's out of the reach of the people and organizations that are fighting them. So if there was an easy way to identify and reach the main sort of shot callers, that would be where resources would be directed, I would assume. So I guess it's a case of having to start somewhere. And while to a degree I can empathize with the fact that the first and probably only targets of these kind of counter actions will be those who are least to blame, in many ways they themselves have also been victims of a whole range of injustices, but I'm not really sure of a better way to go about it if those are the only people that we kind of have access to. They also emphasize working with rather than against the local communities. And most of the resources from the project go back into the community. So this could possibly be a start of addressing the needs of those individuals who would otherwise get drawn into poaching syndicates for survival. Because if there are more community resources, there might be more opportunities for growth and development to give people better options. The only thing is, though, I'd imagine the syndicates would pay enough to make it seem worth the risk. So I think that's a whole battle on its own.
Yeah, you make a lot of really good points, actually. And I also largely agree with Robin. I think I agree with you that I'm not really sure of a better way to go about it at the moment. The problem just seems so massive. And if you do any research on the internet on poaching and how to stop poaching, it is all like, how can we stop poachers? Because there are so many people involved in these things. So you get like the kingpins, maybe, the poachers, crime syndicates, traffickers, corrupt officials that are letting this happen, the users of the product at the end of the line, even like professional hunters and game farmers are often involved. So a lot of these sites and organizations don't really know what to do other than to target poachers who, like Robin says, are often underprivileged themselves. But I just think there can be a danger in not confusing, but in trying to understand where someone is coming from versus letting that understanding justify their actions. So it's difficult, I think, sometimes to use poverty as an excuse to justify things. So I mean, there's so many terrible things that happen around the world, like child trafficking or whatever else, that I'm sure a lot of desperate people are involved in, but their economic status doesn't justify their action. So that could be like my critique against one of Robin's points, but my critique against one of your points could also be because of the background of the woman. It also doesn't justify killing, even though they, you can understand where someone is coming from. So if you are economically really desperate, there's probably a lot you would do to provide for yourself and your family. And so you would poach or do any other number of things. And then the converse is like, because of your background, being abusive, you are prepared to take like violent action against whoever. But it's one thing to like understand someone's perspective, and another thing to use that understanding and justify their actions.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree with that, but I think that's why it's also important, like the quote from the website saying that they're trained to first de-escalate and to work with the communities before they use sort of violent tactics.
Yeah.
But my second and sort of contradictory to my own point that I had in response to Robin was that thinking about the possibility of the traumatic background of some of these women, like you mentioned, it could actually be a counter argument to my earlier mention of empowerment in terms of their training. So yes, it can be very empowering for them to be able to defend themselves and to kind of hold their own and to do this conservation work, but it might also not be the healthiest option psychologically to promote violent forms of defense as a means of overcoming past traumas or difficult circumstances. And that's not to say that the project is focused on helping these women overcome their traumas directly, but while empowering them and giving them a sort of violent means to empower them, I don't know how healthy that is psychologically for people who have been victims of possible violence. And it kind of makes me wonder, are they receiving other forms of support in the program, like counseling, and what, if any, kinds of psychological screening happens before they're placed in the program? Because you could have someone who's severely traumatized from living in a situation of domestic violence, for example, and then putting them into situations where they have to learn like one-on-one combat, and that can be very distressing for someone who's traumatized and could like kind of spark flashbacks and things like that would not be healthy at all.
Or like you said, if that makes them develop like a kind of like proclivity towards violence, then it could be act as like more of an outlet.
Yeah, it could, which would then exaggerate their violent responses. So I would hope that their training would focus on, like the website mentions, de-escalating first, which it sounds like it does. But I also hope that they do get proper psychological screening and support, because it could be detrimental to some of them as well. But overall, I think the positives of the program do outweigh the negatives, although I think it's really important that we consider the negatives, and Robin has really highlighted some very important points. But I think we need more information to be confident in a judgment either way, particularly more personal feedback from the participants themselves after going through the whole program and how they've coped and how it's improved or potentially damage some parts of their coping. That's
true. I think it's always better to speak to people and rather than about people.
Yeah, which obviously we can't do in this situation.
Yeah, so but who knows? Maybe we could get an interview with one of them in a future show or something.
That would be amazing.
But I also agree that largely the positives seem to outweigh the negatives, but I really appreciate Robin's comment and the fact that she's the first critical voice I've heard towards Akashinga anyway. So thanks for that comment, Robin. That's really cool. I honestly have no clue what can be done about this. The situation just seems so overwhelmingly complicated.
Yeah, I don't think I have enough knowledge about poaching and conservation to actually come up with any kind of better solution. But yeah, thanks for making us think, Robin, and for challenging our somewhat uncritical support of this program.
Yeah, okay, so the second comment came in from Tim, and he said, so just curious, what's your stance on the food you give your companion animals? Aren't cats and dogs omnivores by nature? Can they live healthy lives without meat? And if not, how do we go about that? So he asked this question because friends of his recently got a dog, and it made him think about the implications from a vegan, like animal liberation perspective. And he goes on to say they would hunt and eat anything really. So that's basically question one. And second, if they would need meat, then as a vegan, would it be responsible to either keep a healthy diet from your pet or to feed them meat? Because you obviously can't really support any type of meat industry as a vegan. You would still promote and raise the demand for meat if you fed meat to your pets. So yeah, what do you think about this question, T?
I think this is a good question, and it's one where there's a lot of debate surrounding it from vegans and non-vegans alike. And I think we could probably do an entire episode on this. So I think our discussion will be somewhat superficial. But personally, I think if you have companion animals and you have access to properly formulated vegan food for them, then you should try give them that. My dogs really like homemade vegan food and bought vegan dog food. And I've seen stories of a lot of healthy vegan dogs. There's actually, I think the oldest dog in recorded history was 27, right?
27, I think.
and she was vegan.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Obviously, these are anecdotal, though, but I mean, there are a lot of vegan dogs who live long, healthy lives.
On vegan diets.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have 2 companion rabbits who are obviously like raw vegan by default.
Yeah.
So that's not really an issue for me. But what about cats? Aren't cats obligate carnivores?
Yeah, so I think cats are more of a grey area because they are obligate carnivores. But as far as I know, the main concern with cats is taurine. And I think it's an issue with dogs as well, but to a lesser degree. And there are some other vitamins that are really essential for cat diets. But taurine seems to be the main concern. But there's taurine added to vegan cat food, like synthetic taurine. And a lot of store-bought food apparently has synthetic taurine added as well. So I can't see where there would be much difference. If you're adding synthetic taurine to store-bought food and to vegan food, then there isn't really a huge amount of difference. But obviously there isn't really, as far as I know, long-term research to know for sure how cats do fare on vegan diets. And in terms of anecdotal evidence, I've seen a lot of posts on the topics where there are people who have had really healthy vegan cats and people whose cats have not thrived on a vegan diet at all. And I've also seen posts from companies that manufacture vegan cat food recommending that you get regular vet checkups if your cat's on a vegan diet and check kidney function. But from my personal experience, my cats are not on a vegan diet. I did try and order the only vegan food that's available for them in South Africa, and both just flat out refuse to eat it. And if any of you have cats or know anything about cats, you'll know that it takes a while to change a cat's food, which I did. I did it very gradually, but even still, they just ate around it. And cats will literally starve themselves before they eat something that they don't agree with. So they are consequently back on non-vegan food, which obviously is quite an ethical dilemma for me. But the way I see it, I had them before I went vegan, and also they're already here.
Yeah.
So we kind of have an obligation to look after them.
Yeah, and I think cats are really the only animals, as far as I know, that are domesticated who we keep as pets. Like, cats are probably the only carnivores, whereas like all the other domestic animals are herbivores.
Yeah, so it's only really an issue for cats.
Yeah, and I think that you're right that they exist and they're here, and it would be sad to not adopt cats because you couldn't. People in like first world countries sometimes don't realize some of the privilege they have being able to get vegan pet food made. But I also have some other friends who besides for the issue of what they feed the cats, they don't let the cats outside because environmentally cats can be a disaster and they can breed and like kill everything and disrupt the ecosystem. So they don't let them outside because they don't want the cats to hunt. And when I stayed with them, I wasn't really sure how I felt about it because on the one hand I get it, they can really mess with the ecosystem, but on the other hand they didn't choose to be there, and I feel like it sucks that they can't do what they would naturally have the urge to do. And I don't know, what do you think about that issue?
Yeah, that's actually quite a big welfare concern that I think is quite widely studied, in that, especially with cats, there's this very like tricky balance of improving their welfare and maintaining like a healthy ecosystem and environment. So on the one hand, you don't want to compromise the welfare of the animals that are living with you, but it's also can be seen as irresponsible to just let them out and, like you say, wreak havoc on the ecosystem. So the fact that we even have cats domesticated is the main problem. But that's a whole other debate, I think. But on this topic, I think my main opinion either way is that if you can feed your companion animal vegan food and they're healthy, that's awesome. If not, that's also okay. And it might seem hypocritical, but most store-bought food isn't using animal products that are raised specifically for this purpose. So I don't think it can really be seen as increasing demand for animal products, and I stand to be corrected on this. But essentially, it's the way I see it, it's byproducts of an industry that only exists because we live in a speciesist world.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the animals themselves won't really care about like the ethics of why they're eating a vegan diet. So it's up to you to take care of them in the best way you can. And I feel like it would be really irresponsible to make them unhealthy or to suffer because of your ethics. So like, I think it's quite subjective. And I do have vegan friends who won't adopt cats just because for this reason, that they want to just consistently not buy any animal products. But I think cats still need to be adopted, but I mean, there are so many other species that need to be adopted that are herbivorous. So it's not really an issue for most of the species we'll adopt as companion animals.
Yeah, and I think like overall, maybe my view on this is too simplistic, but I think often this issue is raised by non-vegans who kind of want to poke holes in veganism so that they have an excuse to reject veganism as a whole. Obviously, this is not the case with Tim. That's also debated among a lot of vegans as well, but often it is that reason that they just want to poke holes in veganism. But in my opinion, by the time we have an almost vegan world, I would imagine that there will be multiple and better companies producing really good quality and adequate vegan food for companion animals. So it will be less of a health concern to feed all companion animals vegan diets. But there will also be much less need to adopt as many animals because people will be breeding less. If they have an anti-speciesist mindset, you're going to be adopting animals from shelters, and there'll be less animals in shelters because there'll be less breeding. So all of these issues are really interconnected, and I think they'll improve kind of in parallel. So in my opinion, it's pretty silly to agonize too much over an issue like this. Obviously, it's an ethical dilemma for vegans, but it's going to necessarily be a gray area while we're still trying to get through to the majority of people to change their way of thinking. And Gary Francione actually makes a pretty good point in this regard, in that when you're trying to be an ethical vegan, there's a difference between something being morally justifiable and morally excusable. So if you consider yourself an ethical vegan, is it morally justifiable to feed other dead animals to your companion animals? Absolutely not. It's essentially hypocritical. But is it morally excusable? In this case, sometimes I think it is. So while you can't justify it morally, you can excuse it morally. And also, as you mentioned earlier, the fact that it's quite privileged to be like, okay, well, your companion animals must be vegan. Because there are also a lot of underprivileged people who have companion animals and they take really good care of them. And those animals would otherwise be in shelters or on the streets. And a lot of those people can barely afford to feed themselves, but they still make sure they feed their animals. Are you really going to go to them and say, well, there's only one brand of vegan food available for your dog in South Africa? Are you going to spend hundreds of rands to order online, even though you probably don't have access to a computer? Yeah. Otherwise, you're not vegan.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point to keep in mind. It's just your position of privilege when it comes to companion animals. And I think that in terms of veganism and animal liberation, really, like, humans and our habits are where we should be focusing our attention and not as much on our companion animals.
Yeah.
It's also, I think, dangerous to excuse what you would consider the natural behavior of an animal to justify what they do. So, like Tim said, dogs and cats would naturally hunt anything, but they aren't natural species. We bred them into existence. They are domesticated species. Dogs came from wolves, and through artificial selection, we bred dogs, and that's why we have all these species of dogs now. They aren't natural. Cats as well. But the last point I wanted to make was just a quote from Hannah Shaw, or Kitten Lady, who you can find online. She's a kitten rescue and vegan activist in the US. And she says, "I disagree wholeheartedly with forcing our consumer politics on other species, whose bodies have very different needs from our own. While I can't speak to the biology of dogs, not my area of knowledge, I do speak from an area of both expertise and compassion when I say cats are obligate carnivores and should not be fed a vegan diet. This is a complex problem which exists at the intersection of several human-made issues. Domestication of non-human species, who consequently are subjected to our whims and sometimes ill-informed perspectives, and factory farming / the commodification of non-human bodies, whose lives have no meaning to us beyond their commercial value. We created a mess when we decided to domesticate animals, whether for companionship or for consumption." So then she talks about her experience taking care of large cats and having to cut up and feed them other animals. And then she goes on to say, "The truth is that there's no perfect solution to this ethical quandary. Domesticated cats might not be tigers, but their biology is quite similar. I cannot tell you the number of messages I've received about people trying to raise a kitten on vegan milk, all of whom have consequently died. It breaks my heart. These animals are carnivores, and we domesticated them, and we owe them as natural and healthier life as we can possibly give them, even if it's complicated." So I think the gist of what both you and her are saying is that even if it's complicated.
Yeah, I think it's always going to be a messy grey area, at least for now. So we kind of just have to try our best to balance kind of cleaning up the mess that humanity has made. And like I mentioned earlier, we have an obligation to care for the animals that are already here. So, as I said, my companion animals, like with many vegans, were adopted before I went vegan. So if I think about it now, it would be quite difficult for me to adopt another cat because of this issue. But it's a catch-22, because if I walk into a shelter and there are 25 kittens on death row, I'm going to want to adopt all of them because they're going to die in a shelter otherwise. And they're here because of humans. So I think the ones that are here, we have a moral responsibility to try and give them a decent life. But we also have a moral responsibility to question the way that we do that and to do the best we can to kind of minimize harm and secondary harm in these situations.
I agree. So Tim, thanks so much for the comments. Really interesting and always cool to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and thanks to both Robin and Tim for writing in. We really like reading feedback and questions from people. So if you're listening to this and you have other questions that you want us to cover in future episodes, send us an email.
Yeah, our email address is letsragetogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah. So moving on to the next segment, our usual bad and rad, where we discuss a couple of things that we each think are bad and then 2 things that we think are generally quite rad. Pete, what's your first bad?
Okay, so my first bad, please don't hate me everyone, is the royal wedding. Actually, I don't care if you hate me. The royal wedding is my first bad. Honestly, who cares? It's like unnecessary entertainment. Can the amount of money be spent on it really be justified? Which was £32 million.
It's unbelievable.
Okay, but what's more unbelievable is the breakdown of that. The wedding cost £2 million. The security for the wedding cost £30 million.
How much security do they need?
I don't know, but like that is 43 million US dollars, 540 million rand.
I can't even fathom that amount of money.
It's unfathomable. It's massive. Also, what makes it unbelievable is that the £30 million for the security was paid by the government, so taxpayers paid. And the royal family, who are stinking rich, paid the £2 million.
That's ridiculous.
And I just think, if they have a massive family fortune, why is any tax going to them? Why is there even a royal family? What is the point of a monarchy? What is the point other than just simply keeping up to the tradition and making more royal people?
These are the questions, Pete.
Besides my very obvious objections as an anarchist, it just seems like so objectively ridiculous. Like,
Totally.
Why are we entertaining this? Why does it even around? And what also bums me out is that apparently 39% of the world's population watched this wedding.
Of the world's population.
Yeah.
Guys, get a hobby.
I just don't really get it. So that's my first bad. What's yours?
Mine is actually also, I'm just going to latch onto your royal wedding one. I hate this shit so much. I really do. I actually did not even watch 1 second of the royal wedding. I didn't even know it was happening till I started seeing social media posts of people drinking champagne saying they're celebrating the royal wedding. And I'm like, why? You don't know them? I don't understand.
Exactly.
And the next mention I had was a friend of mine sent me a message asking if I saw the horses that they used. And obviously I didn't, because I didn't watch any of it. But I went and looked briefly at the news and at their little whatever parade, I think it was after the wedding, where they used a bunch of horses. And the kind of news headline was something along the lines of viewers of the royal wedding spot a naughty horse or some crap like that.
Oh my shit, really.
And they were in this fancy ass parade with their horses and carriages and whatever, and one of the horses kind of went out of line quite badly. And people obviously thought this was hilarious or whatever they were thinking.
Naughty.
Yeah, naughty.
God.
If you saw the crowd, well, obviously you probably did if you're listening to this, because half the world watched this stupid wedding. Like, there are thousands and thousands of people on the side cheering and like making noise. Can you imagine how stressful that is for the horses? Never mind that they're being exploited in the first place and carrying around a bunch of rich people.
Yeah.
You know.
I also just can't get over the fact that they called the horse naughty.
Yeah.
Like, it's so weird.
It's ridiculous. And it must have been so hectic for those horses going through those massive crowds when it's 2018. You really don't need to be pulled along by a bunch of horses.
It's 2018.
Honestly.
We don't need a monarchy.
Yeah. Give that money to people who need it.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine they just halved the cost of the wedding and gave the rest of the money to people who don't have food. I mean...
I don't know. Also, just the fact that there's so many issues to focus on and everyone's focusing their attention on this royal family who literally do nothing.
Yeah, imagine how much, like, horrendous shit was going on while everyone was glued to the TV.
Feels like an episode of Black Mirror.
Yes, exactly. I feel guilty that we actually spent any seconds of this podcast even mentioning the royal wedding. Anyone listening, I'm really sorry that we put this into your ears.
Okay, so my second bad is the dialogue in South Africa at the moment about things like protests, for example, Fees Must Fall, and land reclamation. I find the reaction from people to be very reactionary, ignorant, immature, and shows a deep unwillingness to listen or learn from each other.
Yeah.
And so that is just really bugs me a lot. To go online and see people marching with white crosses and this fucking nationalism that comes from people and stickers on cars like no boer, no pup. Just realize the deep racism that is in statements like that.
Yeah, you might want to just translate that if anyone overseas is listening.
So when you see something like no boer, no pup, let's break that down for a second. Boer is referring to farmers in South Africa. It kind of ties in with Afrikaans farmers specifically because boer in Dutch and Afrikaans is farmer. So they basically are creating their own category of person, saying no boer, so none of us. It already creates an us versus them mentality. Pup is a very cheap
It's maize meal.
Maize meal.
Yeah.
That a lot of people in South Africa eat because you can buy massive bags of it for really cheap and it's filling.
It's like a staple food of a lot of people living in poverty.
Yeah. Who also happen to be mostly black, if not all black. Okay. And the farm murders and this white genocide, in inverted commas, and everything that's happening that people are creating this dialogue around is focused on this. So they are basically saying, hey, black people, if you kill us, we can't give you pup.
Like
So,
you need us, basically.
yes. So how does that help in any way to create any meaningful dialogue and help us move forward, especially when the government's talking about things like land reclamation, and then there's people who are taking up arms in the desert and stuff to prepare for this like war and inverted commas again, white genocide. What a bunch of shit.
And
honestly.
literally people just want equality. That's all.
Yeah. So, yeah. What's your second bad?
Okay, so mine is a kind of ongoing issue, especially in Africa and South Africa. It's just the number of girls who miss school because of menstruation. And there's kind of a debate around how many girls actually physically miss school because of their periods. But one estimation is that about 2 million schoolgirls miss a number of days of school each year because they can't afford sanitary products. And UNICEF estimated about 10% of girls in Africa miss school because of menstruation. And there was quite a bit of conflicting info about the stats. But the issue is not really how many days of school they're missing because of it. Because, I read an article where they were saying a lot of girls are actually, they're going to school the same amount of days as boys for the most part. But the stats obviously don't show why they were absent. They just show days of absenteeism. But that's actually probably more concerning because people are focusing on that and on the number of days rather than the fact that a lot of girls are just suffering through it. There are girls who are using things like paper and newspaper and socks and things like that as sanitary products because they just can't afford proper sanitary products. So there's a whole lot of hygiene issues, obviously self-confidence issues, and just general overall physical and psychological health. And when Zuma was president, he promised, I think in 2011, that sanitary pads would be free for girls, and they are still not.
They're taxed as a luxury item, right?
Yeah, and there are free condoms everywhere, and having sex is a choice. Like, menstruation is not.
Yeah.
And yet there are girls who are literally missing school or getting sick because they can't afford pads, and yet condoms are free. I don't understand that. It makes me so angry. So moving on to the rads though, my first rad is that there are companies that are doing a lot of really cool work in this area. There's 3 that I know of: Dignity Dreams, Subz Pads, and Project Dignity, which there are quite a few more, I think, but we'll link these in the show notes if you want to support them. So all of these companies essentially make packs to give to girls who can't afford sanitary products, and it's basically reusable sanitary pads that are made up. They make up like a little pack with some underwear and some of these pads, and the set can last them 3 to 5 years, and it's washable and reusable. So that can kind of solve a lot of problems. And Dignity Dreams, for example, I'm not sure about the others, but I really like the idea of this organization because I know they also empower women to start small businesses. So there are actually women who run businesses making these products, and they earn an income off of that, and then obviously those products then get donated to the girls in need. And it's something ridiculously cheap, like 130 Rand to buy one of these packs. So if you are also enraged by this problem and want to do something about it, check out the organizations in the show notes and support them.
That's awesome. Just to make a point, like I don't personally feel like liberation will be found in jobs or like entrepreneurship or job creation or something. But in a patriarchal society that's so oppressive, I think it is quite liberatory for women to be financially independent.
Totally.
And so that is really great that they're doing that. Can I just point out that this pack costs 130 Rand and the royal wedding cost 32 million pounds.
Exactly.
So why not just have a small wedding and then buy every
girl in
ever.
Africa that can't afford sanitary products, give her one of these packs and have a slightly smaller wedding cake.
Yeah, come on.
You know what I mean? Anyway, what is your first rad?
So my good friend Tom McWilliam in Durban is a really good photographer, and he's honestly the highlight of my Instagram feed. I really love his photos so much. He generally takes pictures of landscapes, a lot of the Drakensberg mountain range. The way he takes photos is very much like you can tell Tom took this photo. So honestly, it makes my day when I see his photos, and I often just go onto his Instagram feed and browse through his photos.
Yeah, his photos are really amazing, and they will make you want to escape into nature and forget about the world.
Yeah, they also have this kind of like dark, melancholy kind of vibe about them a lot of the time, and well done, Tom. You're bringing positive things into this world. So if you want to go check him out, his Instagram handle is @TommyScapes. So that's TOMMY_scapes, SCAPES. What's your second rad?
My second rad ties into the main topic of today because we're talking about mental health. Is this really awesome app that I don't use nearly enough, but when I do, it helps me so much. It's called Insight Timer, and it's a free app with literally hundreds of meditations, guided and otherwise. So if you've never done meditation or if you're just a beginner, this is a really amazing app to just help you kind of clear your mind. And there's different meditations, from sleep meditations to morning meditations to there's just so many. There is a lot of like spiritual and that sort of thing on there, which I'm not a fan of, but you can filter that out, which is really cool. And you can filter out like religious kind of messaging in the meditations. So it's just a really amazing app, and because it's free and there's just so much content, I would seriously recommend it, especially if you are struggling with mental health and stress and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, you recommended that to me too, and I use it every day. So thanks, T.
And has it helped, Pete?
It helps a lot.
What's your second rad?
So my second rad is prefigurative politics, and I just really love the concept of this. It's generally an idea put into practice in radical left kind of circles. Basically what it means in common terms is living out your politics in the way you would want the world to be in the future. So on Wikipedia, it says prefigurative politics are the modes of organization and social relationships that strive to reflect the future society being sought by that group. But basically, like, examples of this would be like the Black Panther Party in the US. They came up with these things called survival programs. So they would like feed people, provide education, provide medical care, clothing, whatever, and not rely on other people to provide these things, basically creating an autonomous community, how they would want the world to be. Or, for example, the Occupy movement. I think to an extent, animal sanctuaries within veganism. You could even argue like not driving and rather using a bicycle could be prefigurative politics. I'm not sure. Also like food not bombs. So for example, their motto is solidarity not charity. And so they're trying to destroy class and blur class divide. And so movements like this and people enacting their politics now within an environment that makes it difficult to do it as you would want to see the world in the future really makes me excited.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting topic, and we could probably do an entire episode on it at some point. I think that would be rad. I think a lot of progress in society is generally stunted by this idea that we have to operate within the way that things are and within the systems that are already in place.
Yeah.
And that just stunts progress so much because you can't think outside of that sometimes. And the ideas of how to solve problems is coming from a mindset that's kind of embedded in a problematic way of thinking and being. So you're not going to solve problems by using the tools of a problematic society.
Exactly. Like you can't use a broken system to fix a broken system.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so this is putting into practice your theory.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really powerful. And I agree, we should do a whole episode on this.
Okay, so moving on to the main discussion. Today we're talking about activist burnout in general and self-care. So how you can prevent and deal with burnout if you experience symptoms. So in the US, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So it's quite relevant that we're discussing this today. Although in South Africa, Mental Health Awareness Month is actually in October. But today we're focusing on mental health within activist communities specifically, and specifically related to the stresses of being an activist and the potential for developing activist burnout. So we looked at 2 articles that we're going to refer to throughout this discussion, which we'll reference in the show notes. We might not always say which article we're talking about because there's a lot of overlaps, but if you're interested, the 2 articles that we are referring to is firstly, Relieving Burnout and the Martyr Syndrome Among Social Justice Education Activists, the Implications and Effects of Mindfulness. And that's by Paul C. Gorski from 2015. And then the other article is Burnout in Social Justice and Human Rights Activists, Symptoms, Causes and Implications. That is by Chen. Hopefully I pronounced that okay. And also Paul Gorski again, also from 2015.
Cool. So I thought the way that we could do this is that we could do kind of a question and answer thing because you have a lot of experience in counseling and mental health and have an honors degree in psychology. So Taryn, why is it important that we focus on mental health and activists?
Obviously, being an activist, you're doing a lot of really important, really hard work for very little reward, which in itself brings a whole lot of stresses. And it's important for activists to realize that if you want to help others, you're doing really strenuous, really emotionally taxing work. And if you want to be able to do that effectively, you in yourself need to be okay. And mental health is often not spoken about until activists are already feeling the negative effects of poor mental health or of burnout or symptoms of burnout. And I think recently social media has kind of helped with this in terms of raising awareness. A lot of activists have been outspoken about reaching a stage of burnout or similar kind of conditions and kind of garnered support in this way and also encouraged other people to look after themselves. But I don't really think that that's enough. So we're hoping that this episode is going to raise a bit more awareness about that and about the importance of looking after yourself as an activist.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot more posts about self-care and the importance of self-care coming from activists. Obviously, we are more involved with vegan and animal rights activism. But I think across all spectrums of activism, self-care has been spoken about more, and mental health seems to be being taken a lot more seriously.
Yeah.
So obviously, burnout is like the worst case scenario. But what other kind of issues should we be aware of that could lead up to burnout, like signs of burnout coming on or something like that?
Well, I think there's a couple of kind of related things that can occur. So Melanie Joy, for example, does a lot of work where she speaks about secondary traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress disorder. And if you have ever heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's the sort of common disorder that can develop after any kind of trauma. So secondary traumatic stress is essentially very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, but you yourself have not experienced the trauma. It's the trauma of observing or helping or just generally being involved with and having exposure to other people or non-human animals' trauma and traumatic experiences. There's also things like compassion fatigue, which is very related. A lot of helping professions will get this, where you just get a kind of burnout from helping others all the time and kind of neglecting your own care. Counselors can experience that as well. And then I think it's also important to mention the kind of trauma that comes with living in a non-vegan world. This also applies to living in a racist world or society, or sexist or patriarchal or capitalist or oppressive in general. But I think veganism needs a special mention here, because when I say a kind of trauma, I'm not talking about the kind of trauma that is actually threatening your life, but it is in a lot of ways threatening your relationships to others and your identity. So when you live in a non-vegan world, that in itself is very difficult to get out of, that kind of relational trauma, you could almost call it, because even when you try to take a break, you will still walk outside of your house and see a bunch of billboards for animal products. You will go and socialize with family or friends that maybe are not vegan and have to sit across the table from them while they're eating the flesh of animals. So this kind of struggle and the stress related to that is very worth mentioning, because we're going to talk a lot today about taking breaks and about self-care, but living in a non-vegan world makes that very, very difficult for vegans to do.
I see how that can kind of be separated from, like, for example, you mentioned living in like a racist, sexist, patriarchal, capitalist world. But even if you had like a group, like an activist group that was like an anti-racist action group or feminist group or something, still within that you could be, well, you should be anti-racist, but being vegan and then hanging out with non-vegans, if you're meeting up to socialize over meals or something, I get that how in a way it could be like this kind of added trauma, because you are sensitive to the suffering of non-human animals. And so even within these struggles of everyday life, there's like this another layer. So yeah, I can see what you're saying when it comes to that. And I've even heard activists or read up about activists not really understanding or feeling understood by other people who they relate to almost on every other level, potentially. Even like a psychologist that you go speak to. You could explain your STS or STSD as a vegan to a psychologist and explain like why you're vegan and everything. And then it still feels like you're not understood, because you think, well, if you understood me, then you would go vegan. Yeah. And so I think a lot of people feel misunderstood, not only by their family and friends, but also by psychologists and people who are there to assist with self-care. And so I can see how that would definitely not be helpful in contributing towards burnout.
Yeah. And then just we also need to be obviously aware of things like anxiety and depression, which can come about through dealing with very difficult social justice issues, but also having a predisposition for depression and anxiety before becoming an activist can also make your activism a bit more difficult, and it makes it that much more important for you to engage in self-care so that you can be an effective activist. You have to kind of look after yourself and your own conditions first before you can be effective in your activism work.
Cool. So we watched that video that Melanie Joy did at the International Animal Rights Conference, I think 2015. And she mentions some warning signs of secondary traumatic stress and secondary traumatic stress disorder.
And I think these are really important, because we're focusing today on burnout, but as Pete mentioned earlier, by the time you reach burnout, you're in a fair amount of trouble at that point in terms of having to get back to a place where you're looking after yourself. So Pete's going to go through some of the warning signs now to look out for, because these are some of the things that will pop up early on that you can deal with as they arise.
Okay, cool. So the first one is a sense that your activism is never enough, workaholism. So I guess while you're listening to this, just maybe be aware of if any of these things pertain to you. And if they do, then I guess keep listening.
And I think that first point is really important, because I think most social justice activists will feel this at some point, that your activism is never enough, because the problems are so massive and there's so much work to be done that it almost feels like you can't take a break because there's just no time. Yeah,
or that you sense that the cause or the victims of the cause that you are working towards can't take a break, so therefore you can't take a break. The second one, minimizing the suffering of others. So seeing others' suffering as trivial if it isn't terrible, which can create a diminished empathy for others.
Yeah, and I think this comes from a kind of desensitization when you're exposed to a lot of traumatic material, whether it's footage or just the work you're doing, whether it's with people or animals or whatever it may be. Seeing the worst of the worst can make it seem silly, looking at sort of lesser suffering, if I can call it that.
The third point is difficulty listening. So I guess that makes sense. You can just get inside your own head and really struggle to listen. Avoiding or feeling overwhelmed by others. So I guess withdrawing into yourself. Seeing the world in terms of traumatic roles. Victim, perpetrator, hero. So I think what she means here is that as activists, we often just categorize the world into this victim, for example, animals, perpetrator, animal agriculture, hero, activists. And so that's like very simplistic black and white thinking.
And I think that kind of thinking can also create a lot more tension in your relationships with people who are not activists. Because when you just lump them into one of these roles, you're not looking at them as a whole person and all of their experiences and realizing that they also have flaws and they also have positive attributes, and you can kind of just overlook all of that when you just say, oh, well, you're not fighting for my cause, so you're the perpetrator. It's not a very healthy way to firstly deal with your own emotions, but also in terms of getting people on board with your cause.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. The next point is feeling disconnected from self, others, and the world. Then the next point, chronic worry or anxiety. Then this is quite a big one that I've noticed is guilt. So you may purposely diminish the positives in your life, see others as guilty, or be unable to enjoy yourself. I think I experienced this myself quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of activists do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is a really important one because this is one that can really have negative effects on your well-being. And also if you put that guilt onto other people in terms of their activism, for example, which I think you'll mention a little bit later, this is just not productive at all in terms of being effective in activism, to just feel bad if you relax at all.
The next point is self-neglect. So not attending to your own needs and seeing your needs as unimportant. I guess sometimes the problems can be so overwhelming that your own needs just feel quite insignificant.
Yeah.
The next one is intrusive thoughts and or nightmares. Then the next point is increased irritability. That's pretty self-explanatory. The next point is cynicism, loss of faith in humanity and or the world. I think this is massive in activists. You get a lot of misanthropy.
Yeah.
And just a general feeling of like, well, the world is screwed. Humans are the worst.
Yeah. Yeah, which is understandable when you're fighting so hard every single day and people just don't get it.
Yeah. Then the next one is black and white thinking. So seeing the world in terms of good or bad, right or wrong, needing to take sides, forming cliques and divisions, which obviously it's never helpful, I think, in any situation in life to forget about the nuances and the complexities and to minimize things to black and white, good and bad.
Yeah, I think there are almost always gray areas in every situation.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start thinking in terms of only the extremes, then you're just going to stress yourself out.
The next point is feeling numb, possibly needing crises or stimulants in order to feel. So I do pick this up quite a lot, that like if you don't have something to fight for or something urgent now, it can almost create boredom sometimes. And it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you feel alive when you're fighting. And so when you don't have something to fight, you don't feel alive.
Yeah. And I think it also has to do with the fact that as a social justice activist, you realize how very real a lot of these problems are. And that also ties into not being able to enjoy yourself or relax, because a lot of things become quite seemingly trivial. So then you would feel numb because everything outside of activism or fighting for a cause just feels pointless.
Yeah. Then the next point is feeling martyred. So taken advantage of or taken for granted. Okay, so then the next point is grandiosity. Feeling superior to others or feeling that you can and should fix all problems. I think this can come in where like this kind of celebrity culture can be created in activism. The next point is sleep disturbances. So either oversleeping or insomnia.
Yeah, and this is a really, really important point, because you'll get sleep disturbances when you've experienced trauma. It's also very important to be aware of if you have struggles with anxiety or depression. Sleep disturbances is normally a pretty good sign that there's a lot going on in your mind that you need to probably deal with.
Then the next point is feeling incompetent. So I guess like imposter syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. See episode 1.
Then the next point is depression. I think that's quite obvious. And then the last point is feeling helpless and hopeless.
And that's quite tied into if you have actual clinical depression. Helplessness and hopelessness is tied into that.
Yeah, so if you wanted to check out that video on YouTube, it's called Melanie Joy, Sustainable Activism, How to Be More Effective and Fulfilled, IARC 2015.
Yeah, and I think if you have identified a lot of these points in yourself, that is actually a really good video to check out then, because she explains it really well and she gives some tips for coping and things like that.
Yeah. So we'll post a link to that video in the show notes.
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot about burnout, but what is burnout?
Burnout essentially causes activists to withdraw from their activism, and it's quite a massive barrier to the sustainability of social justice movements in general. And when we're talking about burnout, it's not just temporary stress or a really difficult day. It's a chronic condition that can lead really passionate activists to becoming so mentally and emotionally and physically exhausted to the point where they just withdraw and they can lose their drive for fighting for that cause.
I also looked up on activisttrauma.net. They have a definition. Burnout is a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in situations that are emotionally demanding. Burnout makes you a less effective activist, and it can adversely affect those around you and the organizations we work within.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent definition. So from one of the 2 papers that we mentioned earlier, the one by Chen and Gorski from 2015, I've just quoted 5 categories that they've essentially used to define burnout symptoms. So these make it quite easy to pick up on in yourself. So the first category is affective manifestations. So these are characterized by changes in mood, often related to depression and anxiety. Category 2, cognitive manifestations, characterized by lags in attention, memory, and concentration. Category 3, physical manifestations, characterized by health challenges such as headaches, high blood pressure, and illnesses. 4, behavioral manifestations, characterized by behavioral changes that impact productivity and health, ranging from increased procrastination to substance abuse. And category 5, motivational manifestations, characterized by diminishing drive and increased feelings of alienation and despondency. So I think that sums up what burnout is and what to look out for, and highlights the fact that it kind of permeates every aspect of your being: physical, emotional, cognitive, motivational, behavioral.
Cool. So how does, regular people also seem to get burnout, but how does burnout differ between your regular person in life and an activist?
Yeah, so I mean, regular people, not that activists are not regular people, but
I don't know how to word that.
Regular burnout would just be sort of from overwork, essentially. But I think for activists, especially social justice activists, there's an ethical dimension. So you're putting a lot of emotional labor into what you're doing, and you have a moral and ethical motivation. It's not just you're going to work long hours at a job to get a paycheck. You are actually putting in a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and a lot of your emotional capacity into fighting for something that's really important to you. So I think that's what makes it somewhat different, because there's so much more personal investment there.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Also, social justice activists are more susceptible to burnout because there's a lot of pressure for them to make a significant change in the world. If you're fighting for a cause that is aiming to make the world a better place, you don't want to fail at that. So that's quite a lot of pressure to essentially fix the world in one aspect.
Literally the weight of the world.
Yeah,
on the shoulders.
Exactly. And then just another point that was also raised in one of the papers was that social justice causes require a very deep understanding of the realities of suffering and oppression that many people are unwilling to face. So purely by being part of an activist cause, you have to understand what's going on in that cause. You have to witness the reality of what's happening. And it's a really ugly truth a lot of the time. And most people would rather just turn a blind eye, and activists can't.
Yeah,
they have to expose themselves to it.
Yeah, it's like you are educating yourself about things that would be like considered taboo table conversation. Or like you said, that most people don't really want to even face or talk about.
Yeah, you're exposing yourself to things that most people don't want to talk about because it's traumatic or upsetting. And then you're immersing yourself in that, because in order to fight for it, you have to not only know what's happening, but understand it on a deep level.
So we've spoken about the symptoms of burnout and like the warning signs of STSD, but what do you think actually causes burnout? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list at all, but some of the contributing factors that are quite common and that came up quite a bit in the papers that we referenced. There's an increased risk of burnout within these activist movements, often because the movements themselves view self-care as self-indulgence. Because we're working so hard to fight against these terrible realities, it's seen as selfish, essentially, to take time out for yourself, which puts you at a much higher risk for burnout.
Yeah, because you essentially are creating like this culture of selflessness. So that discourages you from like focusing on yourself and making sure you're okay, because you feel like any time spent on yourself is time taken away from the cause you're working on. Yeah.
Another really important point that was raised in one of the papers was that it's really important to recognize biases within the movements where marginalized people have to cope with the possibility of burnout while possibly being disempowered by fellow activists. So even, for example, if we're doing vegan activism, it's still possible to experience racial discrimination within the movement or sexism. If you look at all of the kind of well-known vegan activists, most of them are men.
Yeah.
And that is not because men are doing all the work.
Yeah, the majority of vegans are women.
Yeah,
and the majority so it would lead me to think the majority of vegan activists are also women.
Yeah.
Or like non-male at least.
Yeah, and I think a lot of non-male activists are often disregarded or not taken as seriously, which is also another discrimination then that has to be dealt with alongside the stress of actually being an activist.
So it's kind of like intersectional burnout in a way.
Exactly.
Like multiple intersections of things that can contribute to burnout.
If that's not already a term, I think you may have just coined a term. And
intersectional burnout.
Yes, intersectional burnout.
Yeah.
So important. High five. Okay, so the next point that I came across was that, and we've kind of covered this, but many organizations and activist groups downplay the importance of discussing burnout. This is really important. It's all about the cause. It's all about fighting for justice, and there's very little discussion about looking after yourself.
Whereas it should be an important part of the culture. Like you should meet to ask, how are you? How's everyone doing? Instead of only like working out tactics and plans.
Yeah. So there's this culture of selflessness that sounds like it should be a good thing, a culture of being selfless, but it's actually a really bad thing because sometimes you have to be selfish.
Yeah.
And it's not selfishness. It's just focusing on your own well-being. Then there is also infighting and tension within organizations and activist movements. I think this is such an important one.
Yeah, it seems sometimes like everyone has a problem with everyone else and the way that they're doing activism or their like problematic way of being or something.
And look, it's important to call people out if they have problematic ways of talking or doing activism. But the level of infighting that I've just seen among vegans is ridiculous. It's just, you're fighting for the same cause, and yes, have discussions about problematic ways of doing that. But to attack other activists and make them feel less than because they're doing things differently when you're trying to reach the same goal is just not helpful.
Yeah, totally.
Then also, having such a deep sensitivity to social injustices can make it really difficult to deal with the slow process of social change. There's no social change really that happens overnight or anywhere near to that. And when you're really sensitive to these injustices and really passionate about eradicating them, it can be very, very frustrating and overwhelming to see such very slow progress.
Yeah, and I can relate to the need to see the results now. So it can make you feel like you're having very little, if any, difference. And I feel like this can have an indirectly negative effect on the movement as a whole, whatever movement you're a part of, because young activists might join, or new activists might join, and then drop out quickly because they have this idea like, I'm going to join and in the next few months I'm going to change the world.
Yeah.
When it honestly just doesn't happen like that in reality.
Yeah, exactly. They also mentioned in the article guilt culture, which is based on a so-called ethic of suffering and complete self-sacrifice. And this is something you talk about quite often, Pete.
Yeah, it really bothers me because it's been not put on me as much, but I've seen it put on friends, and it really makes me angry because I feel like it discourages activism. It creates a lot of anxiety in people. It can make you feel like very disempowered. It strains relationships, and basically in the end it weakens whatever cause you're fighting for. So I feel like there's some activists that have this view like the animals, or insert victim here, are suffering, therefore I have to suffer. And this attitude can be so counterproductive. Feeling guilty when you're happy or having fun or spending time by yourself because you have the sudden realization like, there's suffering happening. How can I be having fun? How can I be enjoying myself? Like, I don't know. Is that like self-indulgence? What do you think about?
I think it's important. I think if you don't have those moments where you're completely separate from your activism, you will burn out. It's just not sustainable to do activism 24/7 and just, as they say, complete self-sacrifice. You can't sacrifice yourself to that point because you're just going to become ineffective.
Yeah, I just think it's really counterproductive to put that on yourself and other people. Like, you should feel guilty for wanting to do things you enjoy, because honestly, self-care is as important as any other part of activism.
Or even, if people have identified some of the symptoms or warning signs that we pointed out earlier, recognizing that you're not doing your best currently and realizing that you just need time to take a bit of a breather or to just step back a little bit just to look after yourself. When that is criticized and when you're made to feel guilty for that, then that's really counterproductive because you need those breathers sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's not helpful if somebody needs to just take a breather and then you make them feel guilty for it.
I honestly think the concept of guilt should just, even the word guilt should just get removed from our vocabulary.
Totally. Yeah.
I also like what you mentioned earlier, that you mentioned like you do think that calling people out is important. I also think so. And recently there has been a lot of, it feels like within the music we listen to, even within the animal rights movement, a lot of problematic people who have been called out. And I do think that's important. But I think it can be taken quite far, where call out culture can become something that can contribute to this environment that creates burnout, because it can get really intense when, say for example, you're part of some group on Facebook or something, and when you do posts you have to use like the trigger warnings, and then you need to be aware of the language you're using and everything. Obviously that's important. I'm not trying to be like anti-PC or anything like that, but sometimes I feel like the reaction is not warranted by the wrongdoing. So someone can maybe use the incorrect adjective or something, or the incorrect pronoun or something like that. And instead of messaging the person or speaking to them directly and saying, look, this is problematic what you said, I think it's better to contact them directly, whoever this is, and check, are you okay? Why did you say this? This is the problem with what you said, before you outright just bash them on the internet. Of course, when it comes to like heavy things like sexual assault or sexism, stuff that should be call it out and call it out hard. Yeah. But this call out culture of like every little thing being like publicly called out, I think can just drain people.
Yeah, especially new activists who are like asking a question, or they're using wording that's not really sensitive to other people or to the victims of whatever suffering you're talking about. I've seen so many people have this like onslaught of attacks at them because they said the wrong thing, but that discourages new activists so much because a lot of them are still learning, and as soon as they ask something they get this like complete bombardment of criticism that they will never ask a question again. And like you say, it's better to just message them in private and say, this is a better way to say that, or this is something that was problematic that you did.
Yeah.
And I've seen it in veganism a lot, where there are activists that really have very poor communication skills, and they lash out and they have name calling habits and things like that, which is a huge problem. But they will say something insensitive and everyone will just completely lash out at them, rather than helping them to improve their communication skills.
Yeah, so I feel like and often the people perpetuating this like toxic call-out culture are people who have learned a term a week ago, and now they're calling someone out on this term that you've only just learned a week ago, and we should really be wary of that. The converse of this is that you need to be open to criticism as well.
Yes.
So if you have this view of like that martyrdom, like I'm giving everything of myself, I deserve some reward, or I'm an amazing activist or something. If someone calls you out, don't respond defensively. Like it should be both ways.
Yeah.
So you're looking after yourself. You're both trying to create sustainable activism, and call people out, but just think about how you're calling people out and how productive this is.
Yeah.
So often this happens on social media, which brings me to my next point. So I think that social media activism can also contribute to burnout in a way, or at least some of the symptoms, because you're often going to get these comments from critics who aren't doing anything themselves, and it can contribute to that feeling that you aren't doing enough.
So I think that social media activism is very limited in terms of how effective it is, because you have a lot of people who will be much more attacking and make things much more personal in terms of their insults and things like that. And it can just get ugly really quickly because there's a certain amount of anonymity, whether it's between activists or activists trying to educate others. I just think it can very easily be a downward spiral into a big mess.
Outside of all of this, from a legal perspective, I feel like that can also contribute to burnout, like the threat of certain things. So, for example, some activism, like animal or environmental activism, depending on the nature of that activism, can be placed in the same category as things like terrorism. So it makes it much more stressful when you're doing activism, because you think, if I get arrested, I could be tried as a terrorist. Or, I mean, this is not true in every country, probably more so in the States, in Europe than here. But I do feel like there are external factors like legal implications that can contribute to this.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the fact that you could actually be criminalized for trying to help others is just...
It kind of speaks to the state of the world.
Exactly, yeah.
Do you think that there are any causes that that have the potential to cause more frequent or more damaging burnout than others?
So I think that causes involving threatening, dangerous, or traumatic events will be much more likely to have activists that are burnt out. If you're exposed to actual threats or real violence, or like you mentioned earlier, the threat of being arrested and criminalized, those kind of real immediate dangers and threats to yourself. I think also in many cases it has a lot to do with individual coping skills rather than the cause, to a point. So if you have very good self-care habits and very good coping skills in general, you will be much less likely to be traumatized or to experience burnout. Whereas if you don't have coping skills, or if you have mental health issues before the fact, then you will be much more likely to develop burnout or any other stress-related illnesses. Also, we mentioned the intersectional burnout that Pete coined right now and is going to be famous for soon. Write a paper on it, Pete.
Okay.
But I think also being a member of the group who you're fighting for is a very big added risk factor, and this is just my instinctive assumption. So, for example, people of color fighting for racial equality. So you are fighting the cause that is your lived experience every day. You're not only experiencing oppression in your daily life and having to cope with the trauma and stress of that experience, but then having to cope with the additional stress of fighting for that cause as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's really an important consideration.
I think the same thing would go for feminists fighting in a patriarchal world.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think you are fully justified in that assumption, that if you're a member of the group you're fighting for, it's much more traumatic. I was wondering how common burnout is among activists, and I found a survey that was done by Plan to Thrive that they did on burnout experiences with activists, and according to their survey, 71% of activists experience burnout.
That's a massive amount.
It's a lot of people.
I'm not surprised though, although if we're talking about actual burnout, that is pretty high, because burnout is quite hectic. But if you're talking about like any level of mental health effect, I would think it's probably even higher than that, if we're just talking about negative effects
I can imagine.
on your mental health.
I can imagine that. How do you know if you're reaching burnout or if you've hit burnout?
I think for being aware of when you're reaching burnout, I think everything we've spoken about up to now, the warning signs of STS or STSD, and some of the categories of symptoms that we mentioned, I think it's important to just be mindful of how you're coping on a regular basis. So kind of check in with yourself. Are you concentrating properly? Is your emotional well-being at the level where it should be? How are your personal relationships? And just kind of checking in with yourself in that way to see if you're okay, and being honest with yourself. And also, I think, asking feedback from your support system, because often I think we reach burnout before we realize it, or we get halfway there before we realize we actually need to do some self-care. So in terms of hitting burnout, I think you would know out of necessity, because you're just so exhausted you can't do anything, or you can't be effective at doing anything. So I think it's just a matter of, like I said, being self-aware, essentially.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
And looking out for those symptoms and warning signs.
How much emphasis do you think should be placed on the individual versus environmental or societal factors? So in terms of the things that lead to burnout. So I get on an individual level, you're putting yourself out there as an activist, you're fighting for a cause, you have your self-care practice. But I feel like there are a lot of environmental and societal factors that can lead to this. So for example, people not understanding you, the fact that the world is like this racist, sexist, hegemonic, oppressive place to live in, that can also contribute to it, having to compete all the time. What do you think versus like individual versus environment?
I think both are really important, but I think in terms of individual coping, a big part of individual coping and building individual coping skills is being able to acknowledge what you can't control, and being able to be aware of the environmental and social factors that are going to influence your effectiveness and are going to impact on your mental health, and knowing that you can't always control those, and that you then in those situations have to just focus on yourself, because if you can't change an external factor, it's pointless trying to fight against that effect on you.
Yeah, so I just think in terms of like the blame that can be placed as well, it's like
in terms of responsibility of essentially fixing.
Or of even getting to burnout. Like, so you could say like, oh, that person reached burnout, or that person is struggling. And I think we sometimes indirectly are implying that it's their fault.
Yeah.
But I feel like not enough emphasis is placed on the really like fucked up surroundings.
Definitely. I think that's such an important point, because it's easy for us to say that activist is burnt out and what should they do better, or what did they do wrong, or how did they not care about themselves. But I think it's actually pretty surprising in the world that we live in that pretty much everyone that cares about anything is not burnt out.
Yeah.
Because there's such massive problems to tackle that, I'm surprised we're not just all nervous wrecks all the time. Also, the studies that we looked at for this episode were based in the US. So we need to also remember that different contexts will have different stresses. So the South African context is very different to the US, for example, in terms of what kind of environmental and social factors we have to deal with, like poverty and crime and racism and things like that. Those will all manifest differently in different areas.
So how do we stay positive in a world that just feels so fucked up?
That's a very good question, Pete, with lots of work and effort, I think. So just some tips for self-care and preventing burnout that were raised in the papers that we mentioned. Firstly, do exercise. A really important one, I think, is to find hobbies outside of your activism. Find ways to relax. Very importantly, recognize your own limits as an activist and as an individual. Acknowledge that your own needs are important, and try to find a balance between self-care and your activist work.
So basically do some stuff that isn't activism.
Yeah. Another important point is that support from activist communities and organizations is really important. We discussed how speaking about burnout and self-care is not even a thing in most activist communities. So getting support from your activist community is really important, and encouraging self-care.
What do you think people can do who don't have any kind of community, but they're doing kind of like solo activism? I guess, like you said, social media can be a place.
Yeah, it could. It could be also a source of stress, but I think building a support system is a really important part of self-care. So if you're doing solo activism, that's great, and like high five to you for doing that. But you need to then focus on your individual self-care and finding support, even if it's not from an activist community, but as long as you have someone that you can talk to and take breaks with and just find some kind of support. We also need to remember that we need interventions both at an individual and an organization or movement level.
What do you mean by interventions?
So interventions for burnout and forms of self-care. So we've mentioned this already, but we have to not focus on one or the other. So if you're part of an organization or a community, try and make sure that there is this sense of support and recognition of mental health and tendency towards looking after mental health and self-care. And then obviously focusing on your individual coping skills as well.
So like there needs to be space for you to be able to talk about and say, I'm not okay.
Yeah, and if there is no space, create that space in the organization that you're part of. In line with that point, we need to get rid of that culture of selflessness and open up opportunities for conversations about well-being.
Yeah, so of course it's important to be selfless in your organization, but by a culture of selflessness, you're obviously referring to like seeing like self-care as selfishness,
yes,
when it really isn't.
And self-indulgence, yeah, exactly. So in one of the papers, they actually had done a study on coping with burnout and activism stress. And the study found that mindfulness practices like yoga, tai chi, meditation, those sort of things, they actually helped reduce the effects of burnout, but also helped to sustain activism and made the activists more effective in what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like being mindful will not only help you with negative things, but it also helps you to relax and think clearly when you're speaking. So it helps in more than one way.
Yeah. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with mindfulness as a concept, basically it just means being fully present and purposefully aware in the present moment, letting go of judgment. So acknowledging when you feel stressed or tired or anxious, but not kind of judging yourself for those feelings, but rather letting them go and just being present and mindful in that moment rather than focusing on negative past experiences or possible future experiences, just being here now.
I had actually never even heard of mindfulness until this year when you spoke to me about it. You'll probably be surprised how few people even know what it is, let alone think about mental health.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A lot of people, especially activists, they will have a tendency to not even think of self-care. So concepts like mindfulness and meditation might be kind of far off for a lot of activists who are just very much immersed in their work. So just also a summary quoted from the paper that I'm talking about. Mindfulness practices enabled them to cope with or recover from activist burnout by, firstly, helping them to find balance between their activism and self-care without feeling guilty about doing so. Secondly, helping them to slow down and see the big picture, letting go of the pressure to eliminate injustice instantaneously. And I think that's a very important point.
Very.
And thirdly, helping them more effectively manage the stress and anxiety of their activism. So that's a lot of benefits just from possibly basic mindfulness practices. So I think in terms of self-care, any kind of mindfulness practice that you are interested in could be beneficial. And I think mindfulness as a skill is important for everyone, no matter what form that might take for you.
Yeah, because it could be different forms would work for different people. So
yeah,
yoga would work for some people, maybe not for others.
Yeah, and I think on that note, it's really important to find self-care activities as a whole that are suited to you as an individual.
So what are some examples of mindfulness activities that we could do?
I think a really important one is meditation, which a lot of people find very difficult because it is something that takes a lot of practice. something that I really want to work on for myself personally. Yoga is a good one. Any kind of exercise like running or anything that you kind of enjoy. Just being outside in nature can be a mindfulness practice. Just paying attention to where you are in the moment and what you see, feel, hear, smell.
I think that's the biggest one for me, is being in nature. Like the feeling of being almost like insignificant.
Yeah.
Of the feeling of the natural world and the feeling of the earth being like much bigger than you and your problems.
Yeah, and I think we're so bombarded with man-made stimuli in daily life that being in nature where you literally can't even see another human is such a great experience, because you're just hearing natural sounds and smelling natural smells. And yeah, I can definitely relate to that as well. Just in terms of other self-care, not necessarily mindfulness, but having a support system is really important. Also, having methods for debriefing. This is really important. A lot of people underestimate this. After you've done a big activist event, especially if it was emotionally draining, it's really good to have someone or a group of people that you can go and debrief with, talk about what you experienced, talk about what you felt, find common ground about what you experienced, and just kind of get it off your chest so that you can kind of go home feeling like you're done with that thing and you're not carrying it home and thinking about it for the rest of the night and kind of agonizing over it. And then also kind of related to that is building good communication skills. Having bad communication skills makes it really difficult to communicate your cause. And that makes people resistant to what you're saying. And I think that just adds a whole lot of stress. Also then, when we spoke about calling people out for problematic behavior or language, if you don't know how to communicate an idea, you're going to probably communicate badly and create tension. So a lot of the problems we've addressed today can be solved largely by good communication skills between people.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. So like, I feel like your points about having a good support system is really important. So having supportive friends, keeping in touch with people who make you feel good, and like reinforce the idea that you're doing good, you're okay.
Yeah.
Don't put so much pressure on yourself. Telling people who care about what you think and how you're feeling is super important. And I feel very like empathetic towards people who don't have support systems, because it's such an important part of self-care, and there are people in many areas who don't have good support systems, and it must be extremely draining.
Yeah, especially if you are more inclined to be an introvert. It's a lot harder for introverts to kind of reach out to people, and I think that's so important to just push yourself, even if it's difficult. Just ask people, do you want to grab a cup of coffee, or can I speak to you about this thing that's worrying me? Even if it's difficult or anxiety inducing for you to approach people that you don't really know well, but it's so important to start building those connections, because I think also a lot of activists have this idea that they should be strong, and if they are feeling isolated, it's easy for them to just brush it aside and say, I'll be fine or whatever. And I think it's also important to realize that a lot of activists are passionate, caring people, and if you just ask them for support, they will be more than willing to give it to you. Yeah. You don't need to feel isolated.
Yeah. I think if I can give 2 more points that I think are important for self-care, one is spending less time on social media.
I absolutely agree with that.
I think like it's so much overstimulation. You don't need to be following what 1,000 people around the world are doing all at the same time. And it can be such a distraction. I think so many people use it to procrastinate.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is overwhelming. Let me be on social media.
And I think it does pass time when you're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, but it actually just adds to the problem.
Yeah.
Like you say, it's just overstimulation.
And I think there's been studies to prove that it can become an addiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of that, I think it goes without saying, but using substances to cope is obviously really bad in any movement in life in general. It's like the reason why I'm straight edge and choose to stay sober, because I feel like not only is it eliminating unnecessary factors that can contribute to poor mental health, but it can also make you more effective, more dangerous as an activist. And so I'm not advocating that everyone be straight edge, but that works for me.
Yeah.
Same. And I feel like just the avoidance of substances at all just simplifies things a lot.
Yeah, and I think aside from the fact that pretty much every mental health condition you can think of will be made worse by abusing substances. So it's, as you mentioned, it's really not in your best interest to abuse substances if you have any kind of mental health issues. It can spark off a lot of mental health issues that you might have thought you don't have, like depression and anxiety. You're much more likely to experience that if you're just coping with substances and not dealing with the actual problem. And like you said, in terms of being effective as an activist, even if you think about having a late night drinking or whatever, if you're going to do activism the next day feeling hungover, you're not going to be as efficient or effective as you could be.
Yeah, I think that almost goes without saying.
Yeah.
If you're hungover, you're going to be grumpy. You're not going to be thinking clearly. Like, why not rather try be mentally sharp?
Yeah, just be straight edge.
Yeah.
Just kidding. We're not judging you if you're not straight edge.
So what can you do for someone else who you can see is setting themselves up for burnout?
I think this is really important because, like we mentioned earlier, by the time you hit burnout or by the time you realize that you're getting burnt out, a lot of damage has already been done. So if you know someone well and you work alongside an activist or friend and you can see that they are experiencing some of these symptoms but ignoring them, then I think the most important thing to do is just support them. Be there for them, help them out. Don't make them feel guilty about the situation that they're in. Don't make them feel guilty if they need to take a break, but then also communicate your concerns to them in a caring way. So don't say something like, you're being ineffective, you need a break. Ask them how you can help them, how you can support them.
So I feel like, speaking about all of this, I feel like we don't really know, just in general, much when it comes to mental health versus what there is to know or what we know about physical health. And it's probably still not taken seriously enough. So how can we even really tell if we have good mental health?
I think this is a difficult one because what is good health overall and good well-being? It's fine to not be mentally ill, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have good mental health. And I think this comes with things like mindfulness, being self-aware, knowing where your limits are and knowing when you feel good and when you feel like you're at your best. So you know what your general kind of character is and you know what your general temperament is, and only you will be able to see really when that is being affected in a negative way. So you need to be able to pay attention to internal cues and your own ways of thinking, being aware of negative self-talk or being aware of destructive patterns of thinking, negative emotions that persist. All those kind of things should be warning signs that your mental health is not great.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to tell if you can reach a point where you can be like, I am of clear mind. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I am mentally okay.
Yeah. I think it's difficult, especially in the context of activism, because there's always going to be stresses and a lot of external stress. So I think you just have to, the key is just to be honest with yourself and know, okay, you can cope with this much stress or you can't. Or, ask yourself things like, are you actually taking time to care for yourself? Are you able to relax and properly relax? If you're sitting watching a movie and you're thinking about your activism or thinking about things that are stressing you out, you're probably not in the greatest mental health in that moment. If you struggle to have fun or to relate to people or you're irritable all the time, those are all warning signs. So I think it's just about being self-aware and knowing if you generally for the majority of the time feel okay, or if for the majority of the time you feel anxious or upset or just generally not okay.
So I think also what I'm, I guess, moving towards is maybe changing the way that we think about mental health, and instead of just trying to not have bad mental health, we actually are striving for ourselves and the other people we care about to have good mental health.
Yeah.
So it's like a for versus a not a negative.
And as much as we have said that the world is very oppressive and overwhelming and generally shit right now, it's understandable to have poor mental health, but we shouldn't feel guilty for striving for good mental health. You can still have good mental health in a shitty world, as unbelievable and nonsensical as it sounds, because that is essentially the only way that you will fight injustice.
Yeah.
And you have to look at how shit the world is and realize that you have to make yourself a priority to survive.
Yeah, and for those who care about, like, so for example, I don't want you to be okay. I want you to be doing great.
Yes, exactly.
And I feel like if we all thought like that about each other and ourselves,
yeah,
the world would be a much better place and our activism would be much more effective and sustainable.
And it would build a lot more empathy and community among people as well.
Exactly.
And also just another point related to that I want to raise is that it's still so taboo to have mental ill health. And it's still taboo to say I'm depressed or I'm anxious or I'm not okay. Nobody is going to look at you any differently if you say that you're sick and you have to go to hospital. But as soon as you say you're sick mentally, there's this huge taboo about it to the point where people don't want to talk about it. And just as if you fall and break your leg, you really need to go and get it seen to. If you are depressed or anxious, or if you've undergone a trauma, you really need to deal with that. It should be just as important as your physical health, if not more.
And I think another important thing to just remember in terms of being encouraging to people is something that you've spoken to me about pretty often, that your anxiety, your feelings of stress and whatever are not you.
Yeah.
That it's external from yourself, that like don't think of yourself as like, I am anxious.
Yeah.
It's like, I have anxiety.
Yes.
It's something that I need to work on.
Yeah. Doctors will never tell their patients that they are cancer or
Exactly.
they are pneumonia. They have these things that need to be dealt with in the same way that we can have depression and we can have anxiety. And that is just a fraction of things we're dealing with, and it is not part of our self-concept or who we are. And then just a couple of other interesting points from the articles and just that we thought about to kind of wrap up the discussion. Firstly, just to bear in mind, the majority of activists become involved out of a sense of urgency and emotional connection to that cause. So that sense of urgency doesn't need to be manufactured within a movement culture or within an organization. We don't need to remind people how urgent our cause is if they are already activists. They are there because they know that it's urgent. They are there because they are passionately and emotionally connected to that cause. So by placing that sense of urgency as a priority and encouraging others to do more, that is where that guilt creeps in. Because you're essentially telling them what they already know, and you cannot maintain that sense of urgency 24/7 within an individual or within an organizational culture. And it will eventually wear down an activist's emotional and physical health over time to just push for more and more and more and more.
Yeah, it's unsustainable. And
Yeah.
we're all working towards sustainable activism and pushing this sense of urgency constantly, especially from people who are struggling already to just make ends meet in everyday life, who work jobs and do other stuff. If they're giving like their weekends and evenings to work on whatever activism you're doing, don't push that sense of urgency. Like you said, they're aware of it. They know how urgent it is. And that is unsustainable activism. That's a way to burn out. So.
And then one really, really important point that I picked up on, which I think people really disregard, is that it's not okay to get to the point of burnout and to just give up on activism, because that's what burnout does. It makes you remove yourself from what you're doing because you can't cope anymore. And beyond looking after yourself as an individual and beyond the effects of your individual activism, burnout is bad for the cause as a whole, because, and this is taken from one of the articles, is that a burnt out activist deprives a younger activist of a mentor, which in turn makes her more likely to burn out. And I think this is such a vital point that we all need to bear in mind.
Really
if you
point.
allow yourself to get burnt out, a younger, more inexperienced activist is not going to have you as a potential mentor to guide and to offer advice so that that person does not get burnt out. So it's not just about sustainable activism for yourself, it's sustainable for a whole movement and a whole next generation of activists who need to learn from you.
Yeah, so I think in this fucked up world that encourages us to see others as competition, to value work and productivity over our own and community health, I think that self-care could be said to be a revolutionary act, and that it's actually as important as the activism that activists do.
Definitely.
I found a really good quote by an activist called Audre Lorde. You should check her out. She was amazing. Where she said, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare."
Brilliant.
So thanks everyone for listening. We would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. What are your experiences with burnout and mental health? Let us know. If there's anything I think that we'd like you to take away from this episode, let it be this. Please take care of yourselves. Please take care of each other. And let's make sure that we are okay together so that we can be more effective and dangerous together.
Definitely. Thanks everyone for listening. And please remember to email us at letsragetogetherpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions or feedback or comments on this or any of the other episodes. And we definitely look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Love and liberation.
I ride for my brethren who carry the burden of a future uncertain till the fall of the curtain. You better move. Hold your head high, soldier, it ain't over yet. That's why we call it a struggle. You're supposed to sweat. Check the work ethic in the name. The lessons